For centuries, Africa was shackled by colonial rule. Its people were enslaved, its lands looted, and its cultures crushed under foreign boots. But Africa did not stay silent. It rose. From every corner of the continent, north to south, east to west, the call for freedom thundered louder than colonial cannons. Today, we journey through the greatest uprising in modern history, Africa's battle for independence. By the mid-20th century, Africa was no longer willing to suffer in silence. World War II had exposed the hypocrisy of European powers, preaching democracy while practicing oppression. African soldiers who fought for Europe returned home, realizing they were denied the very freedoms they had defended. Education spread new ideas of liberty, nationalism, and human rights. Economic exploitation deepened poverty and resentment. Colonial empires were crumbling, and Africa's freedom fighters were ready to strike. In 1957, the world witnessed a turning point that would shake the colonial foundations of Africa. Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African country to gain independence. Led by the visionary Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana's liberation wasn't just a political event, it was a symbol of possibility. Nkrumah, educated abroad but rooted in African identity, had returned with one mission: to end colonial rule. Through mass mobilization, civil resistance, and relentless advocacy, he galvanized the people against British control. His words echoed across the continent: "Seek ye first the political kingdom, and all else shall be added unto you." But Ghana's freedom wasn't gifted. It was won through years of protests, strikes, arrests, and political organizing. The Convention People's Party, CPP, formed by Nkrumah, challenged the colonial establishment through sheer public force, demanding elections and self-rule. When independence was finally declared on March 6, 1957, celebrations broke out not just in Accra, but across Africa. Because in that moment, Ghana became a beacon, proving that an African country could rise, govern itself, and inspire others to do the same. From that day forward, the spark of revolution ignited across the continent, lighting fires that no empire could extinguish. While some nations negotiated their freedom, others had to wrest it from the hands of colonial powers through bloodshed and sacrifice. In Algeria, the people endured one of the most brutal wars of decolonization in modern history. Beginning in 1954, the National Liberation Front, FLN, launched an armed struggle against French rule. France responded with overwhelming military force, using torture, mass arrests, and civilian massacres to try to break the resistance. The war raged for 8 years, claiming the lives of over 1 million Algerians. But in 1962, against all odds, Algeria emerged independent, a symbol of resistance that inspired colonized people everywhere. In Kenya, the Mau Mau uprising from 1952 to 1960 became a powerful expression of African anger. Mainly from the Kuyu community, fighters like Dedan Kimathi took up arms against British settlers who had stolen their land. The British called them terrorists, but they were freedom fighters. Britain's response was ruthless. More than 150,000 Kenyans were detained in concentration camps, where many were tortured or executed. Yet, the will of the people prevailed, and Kenya gained independence in 1963. Meanwhile, in Mozambique, the Frelimo movement, led by Eduardo Mondlane and later Samora Machel, fought a guerrilla war against Portugal, one of the last colonial powers to relinquish control. Despite limited weapons, they had unmatched determination. After a decade of warfare and the collapse of Portugal's dictatorship in 1974, Mozambique won independence in 1975. These were not isolated incidents. They were part of a continental wave. When colonial powers wouldn't listen to reason, Africa spoke through resistance. These revolutions weren't just military. They were deeply spiritual, cultural, and emotional. They were fueled by generations of pain and the dream of a free tomorrow. Africa's road to independence was paved not only by movements, but by remarkable leaders who became the face of resistance and the soul of liberation. In Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah didn't just fight for his nation's freedom. He envisioned a unified Africa, bound by solidarity rather than colonial borders. His Pan-African ideals resonated far beyond Ghana, influencing liberation movements across the continent. In Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta emerged as a powerful figurehead. Though he was imprisoned during the Mau Mau Rebellion, his influence never waned. When Kenya achieved independence in 1963, Kenyatta became the nation's first prime minister, leading the country into a new era with a focus on reconciliation and national unity. Patrice Lumumba of the Congo stood out for his fiery speeches and unyielding stance against Western interference. When Congo gained independence from Belgium in 1960, Lumumba became its first prime minister. But his refusal to allow foreign powers to exploit Congo's resources made him a target. Within months, he was overthrown, tortured, and assassinated, his body dissolved in acid. His death remains one of the most painful reminders of how external forces continued to manipulate post-independence Africa. In Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, Amilcar Cabral led one of the most successful guerrilla campaigns against Portuguese rule. A poet, agronomist, and strategist, Cabral not only fought militarily, he educated his people on their cultural identity and dignity. Though assassinated before independence was achieved, his vision lived on. And of course, there was Nelson Mandela, who, though still imprisoned during the 1960s and 70s, symbolized the long fight against apartheid in South Africa. His presence loomed large, even from behind bars, and his struggle inspired the oppressed across the continent. These leaders were not perfect, but they were extraordinary. They represented courage in the face of bullets and hope in the shadow of oppression. Their legacies continue to shape Africa's destiny to this day. Not every African nation gained its independence through war. In many places, nonviolent resistance, strategic negotiation, and political diplomacy carved the path to freedom. In Nigeria, a rising class of educated elites, journalists and activists began pushing for self-governance during the 1940s. They formed political parties, organized conferences, and used their knowledge of British legal and political systems to demand reform. Leaders like Nnamdi Azikiwe and Obafemi Awolowo rallied the people with powerful words, not weapons. After years of pressure, Nigeria achieved a peaceful transition to independence in 1960 with minimal bloodshed. Senegal followed a similar course. Under the leadership of Léopold Senghor, a philosopher, poet, and statesman, Senegal negotiated a peaceful exit from French rule. Senghor used cultural nationalism and diplomacy, not rebellion, to push for independence. In 1960, Senegal became a sovereign nation with Senghor as its first president. He emphasized unity and intellectual strength, co-founding the Negritude movement, which celebrated African heritage and pride. Tanzania, then Tanganyika, was guided by the calm and principled leadership of Julius Nyerere. Known for his integrity and humility, Nyerere mobilized his people through education and grassroots organizing. He preached nonviolence and cooperation, and in 1961, Tanganyika achieved independence peacefully. 2 years later, it united with Zanzibar to form modern-day Tanzania. These nonviolent transitions showed the world that freedom didn't always require bloodshed. In these nations, African leaders harnessed wisdom, patience, and diplomacy to reclaim control of their future. And while their struggles were different, their message was the same. Africa would no longer bow to foreign rulers. Winning independence was a monumental achievement, but it was just the beginning of a much more complex battle, the fight to rebuild broken nations. The borders drawn by colonial powers had no regard for ethnic, linguistic, or cultural realities. Rival communities were thrown together in artificial states, while families and tribes were split across new frontiers. This laid the groundwork for future tensions, leading to civil wars, separatist movements, and long-lasting ethnic strife. Economically, most African nations inherited systems designed solely for resource extraction. Under colonial rule, infrastructure was built not for local development, but to move minerals, crops, and raw materials to ports for export. There was little to no focus on self-sustaining industries or internal trade. After independence, countries found themselves dependent on former colonial powers for imports, technology, and markets. Politically, the absence of inclusive governance experience created instability. In many cases, colonial administrators deliberately excluded Africans from high-level decision-making, ensuring that power vacuums would emerge after their departure. These gaps led to military coups, authoritarian regimes, and political unrest, sometimes manipulated by outside forces that still wanted access to African resources. Leaders who challenged foreign influence or tried to nationalize industries were often overthrown, sanctioned, or even assassinated. Western intelligence agencies and corporations interfered in African politics, using debt, diplomacy, or covert action to maintain control. Despite this, the resilience of African nations was and still is remarkable. Schools were built, healthcare systems expanded, and cultural pride began to rise again. But the legacies of colonization created a mountain of obstacles that newly independent countries had to climb with limited resources and little global support. The dream of independence had been achieved, but sustaining it would require generations of struggle, sacrifice, and solidarity. As African nations broke free from colonial rule, a new vision emerged, one that extended beyond borders, tribes, and languages. It was the dream of Pan-Africanism, a united, sovereign Africa, standing strong against exploitation and division. This dream wasn't new. It had roots in the diaspora, with thinkers like W.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey, who believed in African unity and pride. But it gained powerful momentum on the continent itself, led by leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, and Haile Selassie. Nkrumah famously declared, "Africa must unite or perish." In 1963, that vision took shape with the formation of the Organization of African Unity, OAU, in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. 32 newly independent African nations came together to pursue three key goals: support for ongoing liberation movements in countries still under colonial or apartheid rule, protection of sovereignty to ensure no African country would be recolonized, promotion of economic, political, and cultural cooperation to resist foreign exploitation and build self-reliant systems. Though it faced internal disagreements and lacked enforcement power, the OAU was a symbolic and strategic leap forward. It gave African nations a unified voice on the world stage and helped accelerate decolonization efforts in countries like Angola, Zimbabwe, and South Africa. The vision of Pan-Africanism wasn't just political, it was deeply cultural. It encouraged Africans to reclaim their languages, celebrate their identities, and unite through shared history and struggle. Today's African Union, AU, formed in 2002, is the modern continuation of that dream. While challenges remain, Pan-Africanism laid the foundation for African solidarity, self-determination, and hope. In the hearts of millions, the dream of a truly united Africa still burns. The unfinished revolution, the 1950s to 1970s, were a tidal wave of change. By 1980, almost every African country had thrown off the shackles of colonial rule. But freedom came with scars and new struggles. Economic neo-colonialism, political instability, cultural dislocation. Yet the spirit of resistance, the spirit of those who fought with words, with weapons, with dreams, lives on. Africa's story is not one of victimhood. It is a story of survival, of resilience, of triumph against impossible odds. The revolution for true freedom is not over, but the first battles were won by the brave souls who refused to bow. Africa's fight for freedom changed the world, but its true story is often untold. If you believe these stories deserve to be heard, share this video, subscribe, and leave a comment honoring the heroes who fought for dignity and self-determination. The journey continues, and so does the need to tell the truth. In Part 9, we will uncover how colonizers tried to erase Africa's history and rewrite its narrative, destroying ancient knowledge, twisting education, and building myths that still haunt the world today. Next title, Colonial Lies: How the British Erased and Rewrote History. Stay tuned.